Oh, hello, everyone. I think we're live. So welcome back again to the third session now in a link of, I believe, 6 on one of Paul Weller's latest books. And today we're going into the second part of the book, and we're going to focus on the third chapter. The second part is called Islamic Rootedness, Taboo Breaking, and Socio-Religious Implications. I did get a little ahead of myself, and I was just telling Paul before we began, and I read the 4th chapter, so then I had to go back and kind of read the 3rd chapter. So hopefully I won't get the content of both mixed up this week in this week's discussion. But it was nice to start a little bit later and then kind of come forward because there were quite a few interesting points of discussion. So at least next week, well, I'm sure we'll have an enjoyable discussion this week, but at least I'm kind of prepared early for next week. Paul, welcome once again, and thank you for dedicating, your time to be here with us again.
Thank you. And I think before anything else, I'd like just to say, in case there's anyone watching who has relatives or friends who've been touched directly or indirectly by what's recently happened in Istanbul, we should bear them in our minds, thoughts and prayers at this time. So I don't want to talk ignoring that context, because part of what that chapter starts off about is Turkey as an environment in turmoil, out of which Gülen came, and one can see that turmoil still there. So unfortunately, I was kind of reflecting on the terrorist attacks that had happened, I think, a few years ago, and I think it was kind of 2015, maybe 14 onwards. For a few years, there was quite a lot of intense attacks, both sort of ISIS-inspired attacks and from the PKK as well. But it had been quiet for a while, unfortunately. The attack again has... it's one of those things that I think touches the whole kind of Turkish community and, of course, the international community as well, because in any case, no one feels comfortable in situations in which civilians are impacted. It's a unfortunate real example of where we'll kind of begin today's session, in that sort of context in which you discuss as where kind of Gülen came from, but when I was reading it, I saw the making of Turkey as well, and it's a very kind of recent history. I mean, it's 100 years or so. If we just go back to the kind of Young Turks revolution, we're just over 100 years. So it's all sort of very, very recent history. Where do you think? I mean, modernity means a lot of different things, and you say that it's a point between traditionalism and modernity. How do you kind of define that modernity in that context of kind of 1908 onwards, really, till the making of Turkey? So that kind of 10, 15 years period, which is quite important. So maybe from the Young Turks revolution to Atatürk building the foundations of Turkey, how that shift to whatever modernity is going to be for Turkish society happens then. How would you define it? I guess I'd say there are a number of relevant components. The first is actually, in a sense, comes to Turkey later than many other countries, and that is national thinking. In other kind of European countries, that was kind of emerged from the mid-19th century onwards, in the context of things like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on, and then the formation of national identities and national determinism, and then also in another context, a different kind of context for Jewish people, the development of the idea of Zionism as a national project, a national identity. So, of course, one had prior to that, in relation to the territories that are now called Turkey, obviously were part of a much, much bigger geopolitical, cultural entity, military entity, the Ottoman Empire. And
and that had a different identity, a different starting place. I mean, to some extent, and of course, people looking back on it sometimes might do so in an idealized way, in talking about, for example, the diversity found within the Ottoman Empire. Of course, that diversity was at the price of having to conform very strongly to the overall power structures of that empire. But nevertheless, there was that underneath that, and under that overarching power structure, was a multiplicity of cultures, religions, languages, etc. And of course, in a way, the first thing that happened, and you can describe this in a sense, partly, you referenced the Young Turks movement, but then later also as a reactive thing to the intervention of the Allied powers into Turkey, reactive to that, the very strong formation of this particular kind of national identity under Kemalism that was then linked strongly with a notion of secularism. Again, a very specific form, not what's meant often when that word is used, for example, in India, where religiosity remains very strong and vibrant in the public sphere, but people speak about secularism, not what sometimes is spoken of in the Western European context, but what Yavuz and Esposito in their book call radical Jacobin laicism. It's strongly influenced by, in some ways, therefore, as that phrase implies, aspects of the French Revolution, coming from earlier French Revolution, Enlightenment, but then going into a full program of what one might call modernization through industrialization. So the transformation of an overall society in which, outside of major urban centers, agricultural modes of production and so on were the predominant thing, into the kind of project that one also found in societies under emergent communism in the Soviet Union and in Eastern and Central Europe, where industrialization was seen as a means of transforming society as well. Within this framework also, in those cases, a different kind of radical secularism, but nevertheless under a single party rule and so on and so forth. At a period. So one can't really talk about, in a way, modernity as a singularity of things. It develops contextually in different geographical areas and regions according to where it's come from and where it's going to and what the different components are. But I guess those are some of the key aspects. And of course, out of that whole cluster, and as a reactive thing, again, Turkey managing to achieve, in that sense, what was not achieved by other majority Muslim societies, that is to say, to avoid at least a full external colonization of a Muslim majority country. You might argue that some internal colonization took place, but a full external colonization. This all made Turkey in many ways very distinctive, and again I'll use that word, of Turkey as of what later I use of Gülen. I don't want to use the word unique, because I think that's kind of over-evaluating and over-distinguishing, but quite distinctive. And of course, into all that mix then comes this whole project of defining what it is to be a Turk, according to kind of, belonging to one nation, having one language that's really the language, having one religion, or even one form, i.e. Sunni Islam, and the rest becomes invisible, relatively speaking. So all of that goes with this project in a way, of modernity out of a kind of socio-political constellation arising out of the breakdown of empire. And that forms the background. And I think it's in that sense no accident that a movement in the end, such as Hizmet, emerged in a context like that. Yeah.
I mean, I was just kind of jotting things down as you were speaking. I kind of picked up on a lot of things that I thought whilst reading the text as well. And I think, I mean, you brought together the kind of historical or important dates as well, especially in the kind of opening to the chapter. I thought was very important, and also a couple of kind of terms that I've just noted. I mean, that Turkey kind of managed to dodge this kind of external colonization. But when you look at the kind of radical changes which took place within society, and then the consequences of that, of things like, you know, the 1925 hat law, you know, from the Arabic script. And then, I mean, it continues. I mean, you have the civil servants who are wearing the headscarves, being banned, university students later on being banned from wearing the headscarf. This idea of what secularism is and what the role that it played in colonization takes a different, more radical turn in Turkey. And it steps on its own toes. I think it's a bit like the Islamism debate that we had last. We were discussing that it tries to provide an alternative, but actually it's still othering. In this case, whatever, and it's a very, very recent history. I mean, when literally talk about 100 years of so much change and structural kind of workings in the making of Turkey, that I think it's surprising, shocking, but again, it's distinctive. But as you said, it's not so unique. Perhaps when you look at all the changes that have gone place, it's not that surprising that either the Hizmet movement emerged from Turkey or the kind of turmoil was present from the very beginning and is still continuing.
And that certainly, I mean, I don't pretend to be any expert on Turkish history and development, but it always struck me in everything I've both read about and interviews around Gülen's life, that this kind of continual turmoil. Now, of course, I mean, all states and societies, unless they're dead, have change and upheaval and conflict, and but some of the forms that's taken in Turkey have been particularly radically so. The form of left-right, for example, in the 70s, was reflected in some countries such as Italy, but in that period, with also kind of bombings from radical right groups, radical left groups, and so on. But I think, again, this is, like you say, some of these components that fed into all of this, in a sense, and this is only speculatively, because they could be what I called kind of internal colonization, could be in a way stronger than coming from an external power, because that makes the conflict all the more strong in a way between those who adopt and push those, let's call them now, internal colonization projects, the territory there. And that then goes into the whole kind of secular religious tension and conflict as well.
I've just realized I've unintentionally kind of played into one of the very common Turkish conspiracy theories, that there is some sort of internal power which is coordinating with some sort of external. I mean, that wasn't what I was trying to say. But that is also there in kind of public opinion, very strong public opinion, that there is some sort of internal power that is communicating with some external forces to bring the downfall of the Turkish society. So that is an understanding that's there. From everything we said, I was kind
and
of
of course, sorry, I mean, briefly, one shouldn't forget also the context in like the immediate post-Second World War period in the 50s and into the 60s, and then so of the Cold War context situation of Turkey. Okay, a member of NATO, but also bordering onto what then the Soviet Union, and as in a number of countries, of course, that Cold War axis played itself out in proxy ways, and probably also in Turkey.
And that was the first time that I think when I was reading your book, it's the first time that I've read those kind of street conflicts in Turkey, the 70s, being to a Cold War tension. And then, of course, the coups that occurred during that period and in the 80s specifically to kind of bring that to a halt is distinctive, I think, as well.
Yeah, and also that's again, I think we touched last week a little bit in relation to Gülen on, well, there are those who say, well, if you like, his concern with what you might call bridge building only occurred post 9/11, but you can see certainly in his writings, and he says, I think it might be, I might quote it in that chapter, I can't remember, but people were killing each other all the time in the name of ideologies, and they were just killing each other, and and it was part of a context in which also trying to address a different kind of vision of transformation of society through the transformation of people, and also a different kind of Islamic vision that wasn't concerned either with sort of going into those combative modes, nor was it concerned with purely cultural reproduction of Muslim tradition in the society, or with going into a very internalized form of spirituality that made no connection with what was going on in the streets. And that, I think, that attempt to start to develop something, and I think as I see it, at least in my knowledge of early writings, which may be limited by some of my language constraints, but also in my interview with him, some of those things were not fully developed in that period, but you can definitely see the seeds of an attempt to steer a different kind of course, or to inspire people also to a different kind of course than the main currents that were swirling around and were resulting in this kind of enormous instability, followed by military coups, followed by repressions, and then again repeating themselves in different ways.
I mean, I feel like it was a sort of very real turmoil that Gülen was both living in as in a context and also internally, because a lot of his kind of emotional sermons begin during that period as well. Kind of linking it to the title of this section, his sort of taboo breaking or link, the socio-religious implications of that come at the same time. And also, I mean, you mentioned the kind of mode of production and shifts there. Within the same kind of time frame, you have this sort of migration internally within Turkey from rural areas to cities, and people, this jump really from the kind of rural class to working class and middle class. And you see that grow at the same time. So it's a very fertile ground really for all kind of movements or sort of civil societies, if they can dodge the political barriers somehow, which Gülen to an extent dodged, and then I guess left the country, and he did of course have periods in jail as well. So sociologically speaking, I mean, this sort of capitalist kind of growth within Turkey at that time was an opportunity, I think, for the movement. And you see that in the different sort of medias that we use there.
That, of course, in itself has some byproducts that I touch on a little bit in the chapter and explore a bit in some of the interviews I had, because certainly among numbers of people of a more leftist political orientation in Turkey or outside of Turkey, they have the perception then of, in that sense, both him and the movement sailing off the back of kind of capitalism coming through in a neoliberal form, and being more orientated towards the right of the political spectrum than the left. And what are the implications of that? The whole debate about how far aspects of Gülen's work were either co-opted or offered into, for example, anti-communism as a construction that was there at the time. I know when I was in Salisbury, I had some very interesting discussions about that. I mean, my own perception of that is that, I mean, however one looks at these things now, and in a sense now, you know, for example, Marxism, Leninism is hardly a live option for many people, certainly not for movements in the way that it was 50 years ago or so. But it seems to me that his primary critique in that sense towards that was not about attitudes so much towards property, but what went along with Marxism, Leninism in terms of an ideology, a materialist ideology that in itself sought to exclude the dimensions of life that for Gülen are foundational. Now, of course, one can argue that although ideologically capitalism doesn't do that, practically it often does. So in practical effects, it could have that effect of killing the spiritual or privatizing the spiritual to the extent that it has no connection with something with the social. But you know, that's another whole debate, and it's an interesting debate also. You know, in a world where, in a sense, one certainly in the Cold War world context, where in a sense one was almost forced to make a choice in terms of alignments. You know, how far an alignment took place towards one end of the spectrum, and how far an alignment towards another, or whether a third course was steered. But third ways are notorious for their difficulty of maintaining a third way, because they just get also dragged by the primary defining forces, even against their own will very often. And it's actually a series of questions I posed. I think it's in this book actually, towards the end, that was in a set of questions I wrote when I first visited Turkey and engaged a series of questions about Hizmet and its future as well, about how it saw itself in relation to these kind of global forces. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was a kind of very interesting debate, because it's one that has, I mean, I've noticed it's been raised within the movement as well. I forgot who it was, but one of Gülen's first students had written kind of an article critiquing capitalism, and I think the impact of it on a global scale of, you know, hunger and kind of deprivation, the inequalities that it causes. And when I saw that, I was very surprised, the fact that someone had brought it up, because I think those kind of leftist critiques of where the movement stood in reality to the capitalism that was emerging, which I think was inevitable. I mean, there was, you know, kind of middle way and a structure of such capitalism. But there
I mean, that also touches on and I think it's more in my other book I explore that, the way in which the kind of North Sea origin triad of against ignorance, against division, against poverty. But the majority of movement initiatives in relation to poverty have been what you might call, of the, if I put it this way, of the charitable kind, rather than of the maybe a challenge, because the movement has found ways forward, I think, for example, with division in going, if you like, beyond personalist interpersonal dialogue, into finding ways to dialogue as a means of tackling the wider realpolitik world. But I'm not sure how far in those strands of movement identity and or work that are to do with poverty and combating poverty, it's really managed to go too much beyond the charitable. Not that the charitables to be despised, but that the question is, I think Desmond Tutu used to put it like, well, you have, I've forgotten the exact phrase, but fundamentally what he was saying was, you can either quotes unquote poverty, don't ignore the source. Question what is the source then? But yeah, so that's an interesting debate.
Yeah, and I think this is a reality that if what had happened kind of post 2016 hadn't happened, I don't think they would be forced to face it. But now becoming part of a larger global movement of refugees and seeing the level of poverty has forced the movement to be more involved in human rights discourse. And
certainly, though,
discourse is more shaped by leftist theory, liberal theory, and within that you kind of notice more people picking up on this. And I think especially within the kind of human rights discourse, that it is becoming, as an insider, I can say it is becoming more visible that such discussions are happening. I think if it did continue in Turkey, a lot of people were content with the way in which the movement was growing, and material wealth was never an issue for those who had it. But I think facing it.
No, I would agree with you very much, and that's partly what I also argue in the book on Hizmet in Europe, that insofar as something has moved beyond the relief of poverty alone, it's more into the human rights agenda, maybe not the structural poverty as such, but the human rights. Of course, that's again a whole very interesting set of things, because there are also historically two different ways of looking at human rights. What one might call the liberal human rights traditions, which are very important: freedom of expression, conscience, assembly, and all of those things. But also there's the socio-political rights, which are part also of the human rights architecture in the modern world, but are sometimes not emphasized as much. Interestingly, I was in a seminar an hour or so ago where we revisited what was called the Helsinki Accords in 1975, at the height of the Cold War, which spoke about human rights, but in both forms, and allowed, in a sense, both East and West, in terms of then the capitalist West and the communist East, so to speak, to address each other about human rights concerns from each other's particularity of emphasis, which was, in the West on the individual rights front, and in the East on the social rights. And it was quite a remarkable thing, actually, that Helsinki Accord, looking back to the time that it emerged. So, yeah, but I'm wandering a bit now.
No, I definitely think it's important, and I looked forward to see where the movement kind of goes with it, and to see if there is a sort of kind of unitary Hizmet opinion which kind of transforms from that, and one that all members could identify with. I mean, because it is the human rights discourse and, you know, the discussion of these larger structural realities does bring in other kind of human rights issues as well. And it's a very kind of sensitive issue that I wonder if the movement can come around one understanding, or if there'll be, I mean, there will always be differing opinions, but if that makes discomfort within the movement, so more conflict in the movement, which I think would be interesting to see, but I think we need some more time to see how that will unravel, and also kind of the intergenerational things that are now going on. So the encouragement of youth participation within the movement, and giving the youth the kind of louder voice and say, also kind of helps in that shift. But how far it will shift, I think we'll have to see. Now I'm just looking at my notes and hoping that I'm not going on to the wrong chapter. I begin to talk about the taboos.
Yeah, no, they are in this chapter.
So. But I mean, we've got some kind of taboos that Gülen faces. So I mean, things like the use of technology, but I've got some things on national cultural. Perhaps we can talk about the Mavi Marmara case. I think that was in this chapter. Hopefully I'm not going to the fourth chapter.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah.
And I mean, it's a case, the kind of global human rights issue, whereas a Muslim leader from a Muslim majority country, Gülen speaks in a discourse which would seem favorable. I mean, it's, in my opinion, a kind of neutral human rights discourse that he displays there, but it's seen as being kind of very pro-Israel, which then causes a lot of discomfort for the Turkish setting. What do you think this reflects in terms of Gülen's stance on sort of human rights, and does he feel comfortable being controversial? I mean, I don't think he made the statement to be controversial.
No.
But it was a very, very big controversy, and it's still one to date that a lot of people in Turkey cite when kind of critiquing him, if they were to do so from a more sort of Islamist perspective. So, I mean, what do you think about it more generally, the Mavi Marmara case, that situation?
I mean, yes. I think, in general, my perception and evaluation of Gülen is he generally wishes to avoid controversy where possible, either in a socio-political setting or indeed potentially within the movement as well. Now, there are two ways of going about, if you like, avoiding controversy, and one way is therefore doing nothing, saying nothing, and the other is the attempt to do something and say something in a way which one almost inevitably recognizes might be taken differently than it's intended. And that's, of course, that's part of the whole challenge of an environment that almost the environment itself almost tries to trap the religious figure who seeks to speak into it in a way that is not giving prioritization to one group identity over another one as such. I mean, sometimes I think a little bit, and I hope it's not an inappropriate comparison. He might feel it to be so, but in the Christian Gospels, the stories are often told about how Jesus was asked particular questions, and these questions were often designed to trap into an answer. So the classic one is, here is this coin. Does this belong to God or to Caesar? And of course, whichever way you answer that question, it's designed to trap you. It was designed to trap Jesus into saying something that would say he was approving of Roman authorities, or saying something that limited what should be God's. And his answer was, actually, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what's God's. But he didn't answer the question in a way that made, and in a sense, threw the question back. And that was something that very often one found in the Gospels, in the way that Jesus responded to attempts to construct a response that would create a problem. And I see in lots of environments, actually, sense the attempt from different components of the wider society, certainly to either ask for or take a contribution from Gülen in a way that constructs it to support something. To me, I can understand very much, because I can understand why the kind of reaction occurred in that event. But it seems to me that what Gülen was doing was, appropriately religious and not national. And this is again in this chapter where I talk about overcoming the taboos, secular, political, national, cultural, and the religious boundary taboos, not to be determined by these things. But it's a very, very difficult path to walk, because inevitably, once something is put out there, you cannot control what's done with it. And what's done with it could be different from what your intention is. And this is one of the very hardest things, I think, for everybody, for anybody who's anybody who's a public figure or is an actor in the public sphere, or anybody who writes a book like me, because once it's out there, people will do something with it, and it's no longer in your control. You kindly do things. So that also can explain a bit what they, if you like, really mean, or expand on it a bit, or correct it a bit, because it's written in one place and time. So these are the things I think are often going on around these public interventions, such as that one. But I think I just briefly want to say, because in the structure of the book chapter, before I get into discussing these taboo breaking things, or crossing the boundaries, as I call it, I think one has to again look at where that's coming from. It's not just it's not a societal project per se. It's rooted in the spirituality and an understanding of revelation as well. Because there's part of the chapter I call Sources, Places, Times, and Revelatory Dynamics. So that a sense of divine message that needs to be understood and find translation into human history, and it does so by, as far as possible, seeking faithfulness to sources, but also touching context. And in the chapter, and I'm going to quote a little bit here now, I've just got it in front of me. In the chapter, I put, while Gülen's teaching does not depart from the basic sources of the Quran, also does not see the truth or revelation as being either historically isolated or imprisoned or frozen in the historic deposit of an idealized past. And then I actually quote Hamdullah Öztürk, who explained in his view that for Gülen, revelation is not something that was revealed 1400 years ago, but something that is being revealed to each and every one of us right now in this moment, and how we are going to understand that message in this time and space and actually our relations with nature, with the environment, and with the rest of human beings. And I think that's, one has to take one step back from these crossing of boundary things to see where that comes from. And I suggest it's very much in that kind of engagement and working with what has, quotes, been given, a given, but it's not freezing the given. It's trying to translate and work with it today.
I mean, I think for kind of spiritual leaders, that's their main kind of orientation of opinion. And I mean, the book, it's a lot of times that it is, the Gülen's core theology is based on the Islamic sciences, Quranic, Hadith, Sunnah, and kind of classical jurisprudence. But I think that, as you said, for any public individual, whatever they say once it's out there, it's victim to whatever is kind of the sociological, kind of societal point of reference. And I think for Gülen, at the time that he spoke and still continues to speak in, we're at this place of sort of single issue cultural wars, where single issues are more important for political discourse. I mean, an issue like the Palestine-Israel conflict would always be politically charged. There'll always be a right or wrong in terms of that political conflict. And if you're pushed aside, from discourse, whether you're understood correctly or incorrectly by the mass, you've then got that label attached to you. So, for those who critique Gülen for what he said, he was then a Zionist. And of course, in this kind of cultural war, a Zionist cannot align with any Islamic value in the sort of Islamist discourse, because the Palestine issue is so central to that conflict as well, the ideological conflict. So I think it's why it's an important issue, because whatever Gülen says theologically, whether it's rooted in the Islamic sciences or not, once it's out there and once it's in the hands of kind of populist cultural war, wet rhetoric, it is buried, I think, within that. So for those who are more kind of sensitive to that theological dimension, as you kind of explained, there is that depth, but it doesn't get translated to our everyday discourse. And I think that's important to kind of recognize that. I'm just kind of looking on my other notes as well. I mean, in the kind of national cultural, there is this discussion of, or an emphasis on embodiment as well, which is something we discussed. Especially in Gülen's sort of early sermons, and sort of specific values, Islamic values or Sufi values that are attached to the kind of message of embodiment. So ihsan, I think, is one that kind of pops up, and it said that Gülen frequently uses a hadith on ihsan, which is being God conscious. Does this, I mean, is there a part where sort of the religious, I mean, is the taboo breaking done with a religious discourse? If we told Gülen he was kind of taboo breaking, I mean, there's always this reference to an authentic Islam. Do you think Gülen see it as taboo breaking, or do you think for him it's just authentic Islam and it is what it is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And again, it goes to this debate we've just been having a bit about kind of intention and effect and reception of things. And I mean, the label taboo breaking is a very specific, and perhaps I used it in a way to be kind of eye-catching in a book, in the way that it summed up what I also in the same chapter called by perhaps the less provocative phrase of boundary crossing. So I think Gülen might himself be conscious of having done boundary crossing rather than intending to do taboo breaking, if you understand what I say, the difference there. But the effect of boundary crossing, when others see that it can be done by somebody who, at the least, one might evaluate as having a solid footing in something, and not just adapting themselves to changing context. The effect is taboo breaking, but I think the intention was probably boundary crossing.
And I think that boundary crossing kind of just links to what was at the beginning of the chapter and what we began discussing within that cultural context, where, you know, the one religion, one language, one people dimension, where Islam is kind of brought to mean something very simple. I mean, and you have the formation of Diyanet, and it's kind of brought under state control.
Yes.
I think what Gülen tried to do is kind of break beyond that mold.
Yes.
That then later had consequences. I mean, I think taboo breaking, I mean, that's the kind of title for this section of the book. I think for the the fourth chapter that I mistook and read for today is very suitable. There are a lot of kind of taboos on, you know, violence, freedom.
Yes.
That I think is well suited for that. This section isn't so controversial, but the next chapter is kind of very exciting. So I think it's a well kind of fit title for the section as a whole. I mean,
good. It kind of, part of course, the idea of a book like this is, in a way, it's a movement through things too. And what I was trying to do, I guess, with the trajectory and the shape of the whole was, in a sense, work with some things that have been relatively well worked with before, but add components into it. Like, again, now you said something from the previous week, or you hadn't realized there was, it was about visiting synagogue and and the Baha'i thing and so on. So I've tried to kind of add in kind of components to a narrative and then a trajectory. Again, not, as I say, again, this is not intended to be a biographical book, but in a way a thematic book that builds up as it goes through. And then at the end moves into, I guess, the more on the one hand evaluative, and on the other hand the speculative about the future. This chapter is in some ways kind of sort of pivotal in the middle a bit, but of course the next, I mean, because Islamic spirituality and social processing, which is chapter 4, is part of this part 2 before it then moves into this part 3, what I called Islamic heroism, Hizmet loss, and the future beyond Gülen ? So this is kind of part of the movement of the book, or the intention of that, at least.
I mean, we were into the last 10 minutes. I wonder if we could talk about perhaps the kind of socio-religious implications of Gülen at the time when he's doing kind of the sermons in Turkey, and when he begins to build an audience. I mean, there are different examples of how people become involved in the movement, and I think that's quite important because there is in Turkey the assumption that the Dershane or the schools were kind of the main, and perhaps it was true, the main route for people into the movement. But there are kind of different stories told in that. So there are people who have, someone mentions, reading a book in one thing, and then they read 100 books, and these books are kind of from Gülen's sermons. So there is an intellectual kind of wealth and interrogation of Gülen and what he says before one commits to the values of the movement, or even kind of meets people within the movement, because that's
yes, it's not, I think, just what one might describe as a socialization process, which one could described the school context as, even if there's more going on than just that. But yes, I think it's important to bring that out as you've just done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, do you think Gülen's other people have touched upon the significance of, a male preacher crying at the altar kind of dynamic as being something that the Turkish society was not very used to, and that itself, Gülen's character being someone who as an individual himself broke taboos. I mean, we're talking someone who has extensive religious education through, his kind of family and upbringing, not a kind of university educated kind of dynamic leader in that sense, but one who also has an appeal through very non-stereotypical ways, such as, crying at the altar and kind of trying to make the audience kind of feel and live that sort of religious environment. I mean, do you think his being as an individual is taboo breaking itself? How he would give the sermons?
I think, and I don't actually explore that aspect of things so much, but there are some good articles and other chapters, books elsewhere that do explore the weeping phenomenon. I don't explore that too much. I think, however, what I do touch on, I think in this chapter and a bit in the previous chapter, is also that, so to speak, the teaching and preaching in itself is not confined to the sacred place of the mosque. It also takes place in other environments, and that I think certainly was, you might call, innovative. Whether it and then had, if you like, this taboo breaking effect, because it meant you didn't have to come to the mosque to engage with what it was that he was wanting to make you consider, kind of thing. And that in an environment with this secular religious divide is quite important. So it was being able to go into the public square, I mean, literally in some contexts, but then also through the publications and through, of course, in that period of time, one forgets today, social media, downloads of podcasts and whatnot. I mean, cassettes in those days were, remarkably innovative as a medium of communication and the circulation of such things. And, that was actually in a number of other religious movement contexts. I well remember myself in the 1970s in a Christian environment. There were a number of Christian leaders who very actively, or people who were inspired by them, very actively used this cassette form as a major thing. People would actively wait for the next cassette to come out and be circulated around and so on. And it sounds all a little bit quaint today, because not many people have got cassettes that they press in the box, you just download it over your phone. But in those days, it was quite, I think, in itself a means of extending into the public square, but not limited by the geographical public square, potentially. I think as a person today, one of the things I do explore a bit in the chapter, I explain a bit what happened when I visited to interview Gülen in Pennsylvania, and my perception around that. And I, in a sense, I think today he's more an enclosed figure, if I were to put it in that way, physically, geographically. Now the question there is, whether that kind of meditation or with his people, coming back to the ideas in the book called co-productive hermeneutical circles between Gülen and Hizmet in diversities, or into spirituality, whether that then enables a different kind of universality or not. It's a very kind of interesting question, I think.
I
mean, I found it personally, and forgive me, I'll stop there. I'll come back to that on another one.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think especially on that topic, I mean, if anything, there is anything that holds the movement back, it would be that sort of Turkish nationalist discourse and standpoint, which the movement still hasn't been able to fully leave behind. And I think that, perhaps it's something that still needs time. I mean, I think there was a quote, and again, I don't know which chapter it was from that I'm quoting, but you quote someone who says that, every Turk has that nationalistic sense.
Yes.
And so it's not something that the movement could be immune to or from since inception. But if there is to be any universality to what Gülen's saying, both from a sort of pragmatic view of the future of the movement and also from a religious point of view of what Gülen would be understand as kind of the universal message of Hizmet, if it is to represent such a thing, or what he would say authentic Islam is to represent, then it needs to kind of break free from that Turkish nationalist discourse, which will be interesting to see how and where the movement goes in regard to that as well. We are coming.
We'll have to discuss in 10 years on, won't we, or something?
It's one of the things that I just want to see now and see. I mean, there is an upcoming conference, I think, on the movement on how it faces modern challenges. I think one of the modern challenges is this, that the movement faces this, and the issue of how it faces or deals with poverty. I think are kind of very, and human rights are kind of big issues of the movement. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, I think if the movement is to survive in its new context, it would be impossible to do so with the Turk. I mean, the Turkish diaspora is growing, but the amount of next generations of Turkish diaspora who would want to be part of a Turkish-speaking, Turkish cultural founded and continuing movement would be much less than there is or was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, and that's a nice question mark to leave the discussion on. I'm all prepared for next week's discussion. So I look forward to seeing you next week and having a further discussion. Thank you very much for being here with us again this evening. And I hope you enjoy your evening and week.
Thank you.